You are about to listen to an exclusive conversation that I had with Stephen Smith, the CEO of Amstead Industries, which is a manufacturing company with over 18,000 employees. And this is one of over 100 conversations that I had for my brand new book called Leading with Vulnerability, which is available by heading to leadwithvulnerability.com. It really looks at this concept of how can leaders bring together competence and confidence while at the same time being able to connect with their people and be vulnerable and open up. How do you bring these two things together? To figure that out, again, 100 CEOs, 14,000 employees that I surveyed, and you can learn more about the book by going to leadwithvulnerability.com. You're going to hear the first part of this conversation. If you want to get access to the second part, you have to go to greatleadership.substack.com. That's greatleadership.substack.com. You can put in your email there, and then you will get access to the second part of this conversation. For now, let's jump right in with Stephen Smith, the CEO of Amstead Industries. Well, first, why don't you tell people a little bit about who you are and your company and how big you guys are? I think it's been how many years since I spoke at your event? Like 4, 5?
4 or 5 years, somewhere. Yeah, somewhere.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I know. So, who are you, and what does your company do?
So I'm Steve Smith. I'm CEO of Amsted Industries. We're a Chicago headquartered company. But we have 65 plants around the world. We are about a $4 billion revenue company and hopefully climbing. And 4 major businesses. We're a big supplier to the rail industry. And so if you see a freight car in the United States, it's probably got the entire undercarriage. It's probably all our stuff and everything that connects the cars together. And then our truck business, Class 8 trucks. If you see a big 18-wheeler out on the road, the hubs that connect the wheels to the axles, those are ours, and the plastic interiors are ours as well, too. So we keep a lot of things moving. If you drive a GM or a Ford or numerous other brands, our clutches are probably in your transmission as well. So we do a lot on the automotive supply side. And then our final business is actually not having to do with mobility, but rather cooling. We're the largest evaporative cooling company in the world. So evaporative cooling is a very energy efficient, water-based augmenter and cooling system. So those are our 4 businesses. I guess the other unique thing about Amstead is that we are 100% owned by workers, by employees, and we through an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan. And so that makes us fairly unique. We're a fairly large company for an ESOP. There's probably about 6,000 ESOPs in the country, but we are a fairly large one. So,
how many employees do you guys have now?
So worldwide right now, and we're in cyclical businesses, so it goes up and down, but about 18,000 employees.
Wow, it's a huge company. All right, well, why don't we jump right into some of the questions that I had? So obviously we're talking about vulnerability, and one of the things that I always like to start off with is what does vulnerability mean to you? When you hear that phrase, being a vulnerable leader, what comes to mind?
It's basically fundamentally, it's a recognition that you can be wrong and that you bring that into all your interactions. And it's a recognition that it's valuable to expose yourself as a human being a little bit too. And that you don't feel always the need to portray an image of perfection, but rather that people will identify with you if they understand that you too are subject to all the ills and weaknesses that we as a human race are. And I think you just bring that to all your engagements, and it puts you on more of a level playing field with people. And it eliminates a lot of the defensiveness that is so detrimental to actually achieving good results and good decisions. If you're not all fighting out of personal defensiveness, but rather you're willing to be vulnerable, you're willing to be shown that you're wrong. I mean, that's how I would really summarize it.
Can you share a time when you were vulnerable at work and what the impact was? So any like specific stories or details are always appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, in in the work context, I lead largely through with questions. Okay, is what I do, and so I have situations often in operating meetings where I sort of show my ignorance and do that in a very open way, and I make it very clear that I'm just trying to learn, and at times, there's and people want an image that their leader knows everything, and so you have to be willing to take the risk of showing that, ooh, I can be stupid sometimes. So I once in a while ask a question to one of our businesses about rail components or something where I can be come across as stupid. He should have known that. He's been talking to us for 15 years about this stuff and he still asks that question, right? And if you're too worried about making that misstep, you'll be too careful and you'll just learn a lot less. And so it's really in that context where I think I show myself as vulnerable often. So
okay. Okay, so it sounds like basically you were talking to some of your team members. Are you able to share like the specific context in which it happened? Were they looking to make like some sort of a product decision and you were asking a question about a product?
I've been talking to our truck business for years about their wheel ends, and they do a technology called Preset Plus, which we think is a big advantage in the market. But the chief competitor, which is used in Europe, is unitized, and it's a whole different technology. And after having talked about this for years, I finally recently just said, okay, explain to me what unitized is and explain to me what, how it's different from Preset Plus. And, it's something I'm sure they thought I've always known. And you could tell the engineering person who was in charge sort of stopped for a second and was surprised he had to answer that question. But, frankly, he did. And I will say this, I think some other people in the room were glad that they also heard that explanation. But it was willing to take the risk of being shown not to be all knowledgeable and all powerful that really prompted that situation. And one thing I do find is a problem is that people don't want to embarrass their boss, and they always assume you have this high level of knowledge, and they start too far into stories, situations you're not dealing with. And so you have to be willing to say, well, I really don't know as much as you think I do. And you pull them back to the beginning and earlier in the story. So.
Got it. Does vulnerability also have to do anything with letting people into your personal life? For example, sharing what's going on with you or your family, or do you believe that vulnerability is mainly just about admitting you don't know how to do something?
No, I think some of it really comes more from how you portray your personal life. And then I would also say how you live your personal life too. And, I'm not as good at it as I should be because I'm somewhat a private person by nature. But I do understand, that sharing some things that are insights into your own life really are very valuable in the organization. And I just had my second grandchild in early January. And I have to say, I'm around the office, showing pictures on my phone to people who, normally wouldn't even expect to interact with me. But I just find that for them to understand I'm a human being like they are, and I get joy out of the same kinds of things they would get joy out of, and am subject to all those same kinds of emotions. I think that's very valuable. Everyone also knows I'm a big baseball fan. I'm a White Sox fan, which is not the predominant one in Chicago. But the fact that people identify that with you too, it's just important for them to know you're vulnerable in that way. So.
Have you ever cried at work?
I have. I am a bit of a crier, I have to say. My wife would tell you I cry on a movie once in a while. This was when I was not a CEO, but I had a daughter in her teens who struggled, and we had a couple very tough nights where we were very worried. And the next day, my CEO from England was coming in, and I had a host, and he came into the office, and I started talking briefly, and he said, "How are you doing?" And frankly, I burst into tears because it had been a very tough night. And he sat there with me for an hour talking about history with his kids, et cetera, et cetera. And I learned a lot about, I respected him as a leader so much for the rest of my life, so, but the fact that I cried then, it was important. Have I cried in my role as a leader here? I took this job, Jacob, when my predecessor passed away. Unexpectedly, I got a call on the night of February 4th, 2017, and on the morning of February 5th, I had to call the whole office together and stand in front of them at 9 a.m., and it was right after the Super Bowl, and they were all bubbly. And I had to tell them that Bob had passed away. And I think people who were there will tell you that I was struggling getting the words out and was definitely crying in front of them at that point. Yes.
What, when you're vulnerable with your people, whether, the story that you shared about the tough time you had with your daughter and you cried in front of the CEO at the time, or when the former CEO passed away, when you find that you're vulnerable with your people, whether it's admitting you don't know how to do something or showing emotion, what impact do you feel or know that it has on your people? Like when you see that around you, what's the usual response that you get?
I think you get empathy. And, when you look at the roles of a leader, they're really, it's pretty simple on the whole, right? You're trying to get really good, talented people. And you want to make good decisions, which you get by listening. But then you want people to be aligned and motivated, right? And wanting to be pulling in the same direction. And if they believe that you are a person who is vulnerable and is not pretend to be all knowing, but that they understand that you share some of their values and they see it, in the way you express yourself. Frankly, at that point, they're more likely to want to be successful. They don't want to disappoint this guy who's just an ordinary guy like they are, who's subject to all the same motions. So I think it really helps align an organization motivationally if none of us are walking around with false faces and pretense all the time. So
have you ever had anybody take any one of your vulnerabilities or something that you shared with them, and it doesn't even have to be when you were CEO, just during the course of your career in general, and use it against you somehow, like throw it back in your face, try to undermine you, try to take credit or credibility away from you?
I'd say, my career, in my early career, I was a lawyer and did a lot of negotiating. And I'm generally like to portray myself as a nice guy. I don't try to come in and portray myself as tough. And, one thing I learned is that you can be taken not seriously at times. So there is a risk if you don't have a certain gravitas of not being taken seriously. And so if you come in and show yourself too vulnerable, it can be misinterpreted as weakness. And I don't think vulnerability is weakness, it is strength. But, there are situations where it's very important you to show strength. And a very difficult negotiation, for example, was one of those. And so, you do have to be careful about the times you expose that vulnerability. Now, I will say during a course of a negotiation, as we got into the later rounds, I'm confident that people always understood that while I may not have a facade of toughness, that when it came down to the issues, that I would fight relentlessly for whatever I needed to fight. But you can set a wrong tone if it's people who don't know you intimately at that point. So
yeah. But has anybody ever, or can you think of a time when somebody specifically tried to use it against you?
Nothing is really coming to mind at this point now.
Yeah.
So
Well, no, but that's good, because I think one of the fears that a lot of people have is that if they're vulnerable, people can use that, they can weaponize that vulnerability and turn it against them. You mentioned this idea of knowing when to use strength and knowing when to be vulnerable. How do you define that line? Like, how do you figure out when you should be vulnerable, when you should not be? Because there's no rule, it doesn't seem like, right? There's no blueprint or guidebook. You just kind of have to know. So how do you know?
Well, you have to separate out situations, and we're called to use judgment and interpersonal talent a lot of times. And so, first of all, when you're dealing in not a concrete business meeting kind of way, obviously the venue is a much broader one for being able to express your vulnerability, such as me walking around the hall showing pictures of my grandson, right? In meetings, you sort of have to judge, because there are meetings I go into where I need to set a tone of great seriousness, and that's probably not the one where I choose to show the most vulnerability. Even that, though, when you're bashing a business for their performance, and I use that word in a mild way, but in the midst of that, when you feel you've gotten your point across, and when you feel that they've taken it to heart a bit, it might be that you want to draw upon another experience you've had in the past where you've been in a similar predicament, and you're going to show that, hey, you screwed up too, or you failed to see what they're saying as well. And so even in the context of a tough conversation, you can at points interject vulnerability to serve a purpose to some extent. But
one of the other big questions that a lot of people ask me is, how can I be vulnerable without being perceived as weak? So how can I admit that I don't know how to do something? How can I cry if something is going on in my life? And how can I bring that emotion or those feelings to work and not have other people judge me as just being incompetent or as being weak or somebody who doesn't belong?
Yeah, well, again, and I alluded to the fact that is a risk always, but that's where communication is key, and you can express toughness at the same time you're showing vulnerability. And so you've got to make sure it's all couched in context, and the words and the music don't always go together, right? You can always offer tough messages, but hit them with a soft glove on too, and so it's interpersonal skills and being sophisticated in how you convey both of them. You don't want to come across as just a person who's always a joke, or and you do have to take those times to show strength, and it's just making sure that you do that as well too. So, and I found in COVID, for example, one of the major jobs I did in this here is in communicating consistently, that I understood the difficult circumstance people were in, but also that we needed to be strong during it. And I had to convey hope, and people needed to understand we would get through this, and they needed to be courageous and have hope. And so, you deliver those tough messages. And those were times when, speaking of what you were going through personally with COVID, for example, that you could convey vulnerability, but also you had to convey strength at the same time.
Remember, if you want to get access to the second part of this discussion, which is just as fascinating as the first part, head over to greatleadership.substack.com. You can join a thriving community over there. Again, it's greatleadership.substack.com. That's where we are going to be posting and sharing the second portion of all of these conversations. And there's a lot of them with some really amazing and fascinating CEOs. All the conversations are completely candid. They were unscripted, and I found them to be particularly fascinating. So again, greatleadership.substack.com. And if you want to pre-order a copy of the book and get access to some really cool bonuses, including an exclusive webinar that I'm going to be hosting, head over to leadwithvulnerability.com and pre-order your copy there. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.